Dad, I know why you really left us. The words hit Jared Cole like a bullet to the chest. He's standing in his $1 million penthouse holding a crystal water glass that suddenly feels too heavy in his trembling hands. His 8-year-old son stares at him across the dining room table with eyes that carry 8 years of unanswered questions. The glass slips, shatters against marble. Neither of them looks down. "Oh, Micah, don't!" Amaya reaches for her son, panic thick in her voice. But Micah steps back, tears streaming down his face. "No, Mom. I'm tired of pretending everything's okay. I heard you crying last night. I heard you whisper his name. And I know why Dad only visits once a month, why he sends money, but won't stay for breakfast, why he looks at you like he's drowning but never reaches out." Jared feels his world tilting. This child has been watching, listening, understanding things Jared himself has been too cowardly to face. But why don't you love my mom?" Micah's voice breaks. "She's beautiful and kind and makes the best pancakes and reads me stories every night and never says bad things about you, even when I ask why you don't live with us. So why don't you love her? What's wrong with us?" The last question, "What's wrong with us?" lands like a physical blow. This 8-year-old has been carrying the belief that somehow he and his mother aren't worthy of love. The silence stretches endlessly. Jared has closed billion-dollar deals, but his son's question has destroyed him completely. This wasn't the plan. Tonight was supposed to be their monthly dinner, 30 minutes of small talk. Then everyone goes home to separate lives. But Micah isn't following the script. "I asked you a question." His voice is steady now, older than his years. "Why don't you love my mom? Why don't you love me?" Amaya sits frozen, her face a mask of controlled devastation. She's 32, but looks exactly as she did 8 years ago when she walked away carrying their unborn child and a shattered heart. "Micah, baby, please come here," she whispers. "No." Micah plants his feet like he's drawing a battle line. "I'm tired of monthly dinners where we all act like strangers. I want to know why my dad sends money but won't stay to see me blow out birthday candles." But Micah steps back, tears streaming down his face. "No, Mom. I'm tired of pretending everything's okay. I heard you crying last night. I heard you whisper his name. And I know why Dad only visits once a month, why he sends money but won't stay for breakfast, why he looks at you like he's drowning but never reaches out." Jared feels his world tilting. This child has been watching, listening, understanding things Jared himself has been too cowardly to face. "But why don't you love my mom?" Micah's voice breaks. "She's beautiful and kind and makes the best pancakes and reads me stories every night and never says bad things about you even when I ask why you don't live with us. So why don't you love her? What's wrong with us?" The last question, "What's wrong with us?" lands like a physical blow. This 8-year-old has been carrying the belief that somehow he and his mother aren't worthy of love. Jared's mind flashes to 3 days ago. His mother cornering him. "You're drowning in your own fear. You're making the same mistakes your father made loving from a distance because you're terrified of being hurt." But that beautiful boy is growing up believing he's not worth fighting for. Standing here now, those words slam into him with devastating clarity. He's spent 8 years perfecting emotional amputation, cutting away the parts that could feel too much want, too much lose, too much. 8 years of choosing the safety of loneliness over the terrifying beauty of being truly known. The word comes out strangled. For the first time in his life, Jared Cole, master negotiator man, who built an empire with words, has none left. The crystal fragments catch the chandelier light, creating tiny rainbows. Such a small thing, but it's broken open this moment, and everything that led to it. 8 years of careful distance, managed interactions, and the terrible pretense that love could be compartmentalized. His son is still waiting, still hoping, still believing his father might finally choose courage over cowardice. But how do you tell an 8-year-old that you've been running from the best thing that ever happened to you? How do you explain that every time you look at him, you see your own capacity for love, and it terrifies you more than any business failure ever could? How do you admit that the question he's asking isn't the real question at all? The real question haunting Jared for 8 years is this: why don't you love me enough to stay? And for that question written in his son's eyes, spoken in his mother's silence, echoing in his own hollow chest, Jared Cole has no answer. Because the truth is too terrifying to speak, he loves them so much it feels like dying, and that's exactly why he ran. To understand how 3 people ended up in that dining room on that night, with that question hanging between them like a sword, we need to go back. Back to when Jared Cole was 32, ambitious, and convinced that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Back to when he believed that success was something you achieved, not something you shared. It was October 2016. The leaves were changing in Central Park, and Jared's tech company was on the verge of its first major acquisition deal, the kind that would transform him from a promising entrepreneur grinding 18-hour days in a cramped office above a coffee shop into a legitimate millionaire with a corner office and a personal assistant. He'd spent 5 years building Cole Technologies from nothing more than an idea and a maxed-out credit card, and everything was finally falling into place. Amaya Brooks was 24, then a dancer whose grace made even the simplest movement look like poetry. She moved through the world like she was choreographing every step, which in a way she was. Dance had been her language since she was 3 years old, growing up in a small apartment in Brooklyn, where her mother worked 2 jobs to pay for lessons at the local studio. By the time she was 18, Amaya was performing with small companies around the city, making just enough money to survive, while she chased the dream of joining a major ballet company. They met at the annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala, one of those glittering Manhattan events where the wealthy gathered to solve the world's problems with champagne and check writing. Jared was there because his publicist had insisted good optics for a tech entrepreneur trying to build his brand. Amaya was there because she was performing part of a small troupe hired to provide artistic entertainment between the speeches and the auction. He watched her from across the room, mesmerized by the way she seemed to float rather than walk. When she danced, the rest of the room disappeared. There was something pure about her movement, something untouched by the cynicism that seemed to coat everything else in Jared's world like a layer of expensive varnish. "You dance like you're telling a secret," he had said to her that night during the intermission, surprising himself with the poetry in his own words. He wasn't usually given to romantic pronouncements, but there was something about her that stripped away his usual careful control. She had laughed a sound like wind chimes caught in a gentle breeze. What kind of secret? The kind that makes everyone else wish they were the only one listening. It was a line worthy of a romance novel, and Jared was embarrassed the moment it left his mouth. But Amaya smiled, and in that smile he saw something he hadn't known. He was looking for recognition. She saw him, not the CEO, not the rising star of Silicon Valley, not the man whose company was being courted by investors, but him. The part of him that still remembered being a kid who read books under his covers with a flashlight, who dreamed of building something beautiful instead of just something profitable. "I'm Amaya," she said, extending her hand. "Jared, and I think you might be the most beautiful person I've ever seen." It was forward, probably inappropriate, definitely not the kind of thing he usually said to women he'd just met. But something about her made him feel brave in a way he hadn't felt since he was young enough to believe in fairy tales. For 6 months they lived in that bubble where everything feels possible. The kind of love that makes you understand why people write songs and build monuments and start wars. Jared would leave million-dollar meetings to watch Amaya rehearse in studios that smelled like rosin and sweat and dreams. She would fall asleep in his arms, talking about the children she hoped to teach someday, about opening her own studio where kids from neighborhoods like the one she grew up in could learn that their bodies were instruments capable of making art, not just surviving poverty. They made plans. Real plans. The kind that start with when we, instead of if we. Jared talked about moving to a bigger apartment, maybe even a house with a studio space for Amaya. She talked about the wedding. They'd have nothing fancy, just family and friends and dancing under string lights. They talked about children, about the kind of parents they wanted to be, about breaking the cycles they'd inherited from their own families. Jared's father had been a successful lawyer who measured love in the size of his paycheck and showed affection by working longer hours to provide more things. Amaya's father had left when she was 5, and her mother had raised her with a fierce independence that came from knowing you couldn't count on anyone but yourself. They both wanted something different. They both believed they could build something better together. But plans, Jared learned, are fragile things. They crumble under the weight of fear and ambition and the terrible human capacity for self-sabotage. The pregnancy test showed 2 pink lines on a Tuesday morning in November. Amaya's hands shook as she showed it to him, her face radiant with a joy that should have been contagious. Should have been. The test had been sitting on his bathroom counter when he came out of the shower, and for a moment time seemed to stop entirely. Jared, she whispered, her voice thick with tears that could have been happiness or terror or both. We're going to have a baby. She said, we, and that little word contained multitudes. It contained the assumption that they were in this together, that the love they'd built was strong enough to weather this unexpected blessing, that the plans they'd made were flexible enough to accommodate this beautiful complication. But in that moment, Jared's first thought wasn't about joy or love or the future they'd build together. His first thought was about the acquisition deal, about board meetings and investor confidence and the delicate negotiations that could make or break his company's future. About his father's voice echoing from beyond the grave, his father who had died of a heart attack at 55, still working, still building, still believing that success was measured in dollars and market share, and the respect of men who didn't know your children's names. Mkaida. Appearances matter, son, his father had told him countless times. Everything you build can crumble because of one wrong association, one poor decision, one moment of weakness that your competitors can use against you. Chiti, what are we going to do? Amaya asked, the word we hanging in the air like a prayer, like a promise, like a test he was already failing. That's when Jared realized he'd been thinking I the whole time, not we, I. What was he going to do? How was this going to affect his company? What would the investors think? What would happen to the deal he'd worked years to secure? I need time to think, he said, which was his way of saying he'd already decided. It was his way of buying time to figure out how to extract himself from this situation without completely destroying the woman he claimed to love. The conversation that followed wasn't really a conversation at all. It was Jared explaining with charts and projections and the cold logic that had made him successful in business why this wasn't the right time. Why marriage would complicate his company's public image during the acquisition process. Why a mixed-race family might affect investor confidence in ways he couldn't predict or control. Why she should understand that he was doing this for both of them, that short-term sacrifice would lead to long-term security, that if she really loved him, she would support his career the way he'd supported her dancing. He had spreadsheets. He had market research about public perception and demographic targeting. He had a 5-year plan that showed how they could revisit the idea of marriage and children once his company was stable Once he'd secured his position in the tech world, once they could afford to take risks with their personal lives. What he didn't have was courage. What he didn't have was the ability to choose love over fear, heart over head, present happiness over future security. Amaya listened in silence, her face growing more distant with every logical argument, every statistical projection, every reasonable explanation for why their love wasn't reason enough. When he finished his presentation, because that's what it was, really a business presentation, about why their relationship wasn't economically viable, she asked only one question. Do you love me, Jared? The question was simple. The answer should have been simple too. But Jared hesitated, his mind racing through calculations and consequences and the 1,000 ways that love could become liability. That hesitation, just a few seconds of silence while he weighed his words, was his answer. "Of course I love you," he said finally, but the words felt hollow, rehearsed, like lines from a script he'd memorized, but never truly understood. "No," Amaya said quietly, standing up from the couch where they'd been sitting, where they'd made love and planned their future and dreamed their dreams. "You love the idea of me. You love having someone who fits into your life when it's convenient. But you don't love me enough to choose me when it's hard." "That's not fair," Jared protested. "I'm thinking about our future. You're thinking about your future," she corrected. "And I understand. I do. But I won't raise a child to believe that love is something you fit into your schedule when you have time for it. I won't teach my baby that they're only valuable when they're convenient. Amaya, please. We can make this work. In a few years, when things are more stable, I'll raise this baby alone," she said quietly, with the kind of dignity that comes from knowing your own worth. "But I won't raise them to believe their father didn't want them. I'll tell them you were too afraid to love us. Maybe someday you'll prove me wrong." She left that afternoon while Jared was in a meeting with potential investors. He came home to an empty apartment and a note on his kitchen counter. "I hope your deal works out. I hope it makes you happy. I hope someday you realize what you gave up for it." For weeks, he told himself, he felt relief. Relief was easier than admitting he felt like he'd just thrown away the best thing that had ever happened to him. Relief was easier than acknowledging that every success he achieved afterward would taste like ash because the only person he wanted to share it with was gone. For 8 years, Jared kept his distance. He sent money, generous amounts that his accountant could write off as charitable contributions, to a dependent child. He sent gifts on birthdays and Christmas, always through a service, never in person, each one carefully selected, to show that he cared, without requiring him to actually show up. He had reports from a private investigator about Micah's milestones. First words, Mama, then Dada. Though Jared wasn't there to hear either, first steps in the park near Amaya's new apartment, first day of school, where he cried for 20 minutes before Amaya convinced him that kindergarten wasn't permanent. But he never witnessed any of them. Amaya never asked for more than child support. She never called, never demanded his presence, never guilt-tripped him about his absence. She moved across town to a modest apartment near a good school district, got her teaching degree through night classes while working as a dance instructor during the day, and built a life that didn't include him. Through his investigators' reports, Jared learned she never dated seriously, never married, never seemed to need anything from anyone. He told himself this proved his point, that she was better off without him, that his absence was actually a gift, that he'd made the mature, responsible choice by staying away. But sometimes in the quiet moments between meetings and deals and the relentless pursuit of more, he wondered if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. The acquisition deal went through. Jared's first company was sold for $200 million, making him wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. But wealth without purpose felt hollow, So he started over Cole Technologies 2.0, built on the lessons of his first success, but somehow still missing the most important element: meaning. He bought a penthouse, a sports car, expensive art he didn't understand. He dated models and entrepreneurs and socialites who looked good on his arm at industry events. He was featured on magazine covers and business podcasts and lists of rising stars in technology. And he was miserable. Not the dramatic romantic misery of movies and songs, but the quiet, persistent misery of someone who's gotten everything he thought he wanted and realized it wasn't enough. Success, he learned, was a poor substitute for happiness. Money was a poor substitute for love. Achievement was a poor substitute for connection. But then came Micah's 8th birthday, and everything changed. 6 months after that first birthday party reconnection, the unraveling began with a phone call on a Thursday evening in March. But this wasn't just any phone call. It was the one that would force Jared to confront the biggest lie he'd been telling himself for 8 years. Jared was in his home office when his phone rang. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Cole, this is St. Mary's Hospital. Your son Micah is here with his mother. There's been an accident." But here's what the hospital didn't tell him immediately, what he would only discover when he arrived. Amaya and Micah hadn't been alone in that car. There was a third passenger, someone whose presence would change everything Jared thought he knew about his family's story. The drive to the hospital was a blur of panic and regret. Jared broke every speed limit, ran red lights, and for the first time in 8 years, prayed to a God he wasn't sure existed. "Please," he whispered as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with terror. "Please don't let me lose them before I can tell them I'm sorry. Please don't let me lose them before I can tell them I love them." Jared didn't remember driving to the hospital, but he would never forget what he found when he got there. Micah was sitting in a hospital bed, his left arm in a bright blue cast, when Jared burst through the door. But sitting beside him, holding his uninjured hand, was an elderly woman Jared had never seen before, yet somehow her face was familiar. She had Amaya's eyes, Micah's stubborn chin, and an aura of strength that seemed to fill the room. Dad." Micah's voice broke on the word, and in that moment Jared understood what it meant to feel your heart shatter and mend itself simultaneously. "Where's Mom?" "They won't tell me where Mom is." The elderly woman looked up at Jared with eyes that seemed to see straight through him, past his expensive suit, past his carefully constructed facade, straight to the broken man underneath. "You must be Jared," she said quietly, her voice carrying the particular authority that comes from someone who has lived through everything life can throw at them. "I'm Eleanor Brooks, Amaya's grandmother, the one who's been helping raise your son while you've been busy." The weight of those words hit Jared like a sledgehammer. This woman, this stranger who wasn't a stranger at all, had been part of his son's life for 8 years. She'd been at birthday parties, school events, bedtime stories. She'd been the family patriarch that Jared should have been. As Jared gathered his son into his arms, Eleanor Brooks spoke words that shattered his understanding of everything. "Before the paramedics took Amaya to surgery, she asked me to tell you something she's never had the courage to say. She forgave you years ago, Jared. But she never forgave herself." "What do you mean?" "For not fighting harder for your love, for not telling you about Hope, the twin she lost, for protecting you from a grief you had a right to share. She's carried that burden alone because she thought it was what you wanted." Jared's world tilted. "You know about Toxie, I was there when she lost the baby. I held her while she cried for the child who died and the man who broke her heart. I was the one who drove her to the cemetery when she buried Hope in the children's section under a little stone that just says, 'Beloved daughter.' She visits every year on what would have been Hope's birthday. always alone. Eleanor's voice grew softer, more pained. Do you know what she does there? She brings children's books and reads them out loud, just like she does for Micah. She tells Hope about her brother, about his accomplishments, about how proud she is of both her children, the one she's raising and the one she lost. She talks about you too sometimes. Wonders if you ever think about the baby you never got to meet. The revelation hit Jared like a physical blow. All these years while he'd been building his empire and telling himself he was better off without them, Amaya had been grieving their lost daughter by herself. She'd created rituals of remembrance that he'd never been part of, carried a pain that he'd helped create but refused to share. For the first time in 8 years, Jared didn't hesitate. He held his son while he cried, whispering promises he prayed he could keep. But behind his comfort for Micah, his mind was reeling with the magnitude of what he'd missed, what he'd let Amaya carry alone. Hours passed. The surgery stretched on first 3 hours, then 4, then 5. Eleanor told Jared stories about Micah's childhood, that he'd missed the time he built a dad trap out of cardboard boxes, hoping to catch Jared if he ever came to visit. The night he asked if dads could hear prayers if they weren't in heaven yet. The day he announced to his kindergarten class that his father was a superhero who was too busy saving the world to come to show and tell. Each story was a knife to Jared's heart, a reminder of the life he'd chosen to miss. But at the 6-hour mark, Dr. Patricia Williams entered with news that no one expected. Mr. Cole, I need to speak with you privately. Eleanor took Micah to the cafeteria, leaving Jared alone with the doctor, whose expression told him everything he feared. Your wife. She's not my wife, Jared corrected automatically, though the words felt hollow. Dr. Williams paused, studying him with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every kind of family dynamic in her 30 years of practice. The woman who asked for you as she was losing consciousness. The woman whose emergency contact card has only your name and number despite 8 years of separation. The woman who was wearing this when she came in. She held up a simple silver chain with a small pendant, 2 intertwined hearts, one slightly smaller than the other. She's been wearing a necklace that represents you and your lost child for 8 years, Mr. Cole. She carries your photo in her wallet next to one of Micah. Her phone has you listed as ICE in case of emergency. In my experience, that makes her your wife in every way that matters. The question is, are you going to be her husband? The words hit him like successive revelations. Even after 8 years of his absence, even after all the ways he'd failed her, Amaya still considered him her emergency contact, still wore a symbol of their lost love and lost child against her heart. Is she going to be okay? She's alive. The surgery went well, though it was touch and go for a while. We had to repair some internal bleeding and set her leg. It was fractured in 2 places. She has a severe concussion as well, but her brain scans look good. She's going to need several months of recovery, maybe longer, but she should heal. Dr. Williams paused, and Jared knew there was more. There's something else. The accident caused some internal trauma that we had to repair. The damage was extensive. She may never be able to have children again. I thought you should know before she wakes up, because when she learns this, she's going to need support in ways she's never asked for before. It was 3 a.m. when Amaya's eyes fluttered open. She looked confused for a moment, blinking against the soft light of the hospital room. Then her gaze found Jared's face. Guardari. Her voice was hoarse from the intubation, barely more than a whisper. What are you doing here? You asked for me, he said, simply reaching for her hand. They called me. She tried to sit up, winced as pain shot through her injured body and settled back against her pillows. Micah, is he? He's fine. Broken arm, mild concussion, but he's going to be okay. He's sleeping in the chair next to you. He hasn't left your side. Amaya's eyes filled with tears as she looked at their son curled up in the uncomfortable hospital chair, his cast propped on a pillow. "I was so scared," she whispered. "When I saw that car coming, when I realized we weren't going to be able to stop in time, all I could think was that he might grow up without either of us, that he might be alone." "He won't be alone," Jared said, and for the first time in 8 years, he meant it completely. "I promise you, Amaya, he will never be alone again." "Jared," Amaya's voice broke. "Eleanor told you about hope, didn't she? About the cemetery visits, about the children's books, about the stone that says, 'Beloved daughter.' Why didn't you tell me about hope? Why didn't you tell me we lost a baby?" Amaya's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in 8 years, she looked at him without any of the protective walls she'd built around her heart. "Because I thought you didn't want the one you knew about. I couldn't bear to tell you about the one you'd never even get the chance to reject." "I never rejected Micah. I was scared. You left me alone with 2 heartbeats inside me and came back to find only one. You left me to bury our daughter by myself while you celebrated your business deal. You left me to explain to a 5-year-old why his sister couldn't stay, why Daddy wasn't there to say goodbye." The words came out in a rush, 8 years of buried pain finally surfacing. "I forgave you for leaving Jared, but I never forgave you for not being there when Hope died. I never forgave you for making me grieve alone." The words hit him like physical blows. All these years he'd been mourning the family he'd walked away from, never knowing he'd also walked away from the chance to grieve the child they'd lost together. "I love you," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "I never stopped loving you. I was just too afraid and too proud to admit it." Amaya was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice carried 8 years of pain and a lifetime of hope. "Prove it. Not with words this time. Prove it by staying when things get hard. Prove it by choosing us every day, not just when it's convenient. Prove it by helping me visit Hope's grave and finally grieving our daughter together." Before Jared could respond, the doctor's words echoed in his mind. She may never be able to have children again. And he realized that loving Amaya now meant loving her through loss, through limitations, through all the ways their future might look different than they'd once dreamed. "I will," he whispered. "I'll prove it every day for the rest of our lives. And I want to meet Hope. I want to read to her and tell her about her brother and apologize for not being there when she needed her daddy." For the first time since waking up, Amaya smiled through her tears. "She would have loved you. She would have had your stubbornness and my heart. And she would have wrapped you around her little finger." "She already has," Jared said quietly. "Just by existing, just by being ours, she's already changed everything." 3 weeks later, Amaya was finally released from the hospital, but her recovery was far from over. The doctors said she'd need at least 2 months before she could walk without crutches, and even longer before she could return to teaching. Her small apartment, which had always seemed cozy before, now felt like an obstacle course designed to remind her of everything she couldn't do. For a woman who had spent 8 years fiercely independent, building a life that required nothing from anyone, especially not from Jared Cole, accepting help felt like swallowing glass. Jared had arranged for everything money could solve: a visiting nurse who came twice a day, grocery delivery service that brought organic everything, a housekeeping service that cleaned around Amaya's protests, and enough medical equipment to stock a small clinic. His assistant had coordinated it all with military precision, turning Amaya's modest 2-bedroom apartment into a recovery center that probably cost more per week than she made in a month. But as he quickly learned, the things that mattered most couldn't be bought with credit cards and good intentions. The visiting nurse was efficient, but cold, treating Amaya like a checklist of symptoms rather than a person. The grocery service delivered expensive foods that Micah wouldn't eat, and Amaya couldn't afford to waste. The housekeeping service moved things around, disrupting the careful organization that had made her small space feel like home. All of Jared's solutions, while well-intentioned, felt like invasions rather than help. It was Micah who broke the stalemate with the particular brand of logic that only children possess. He said one afternoon as Jared was preparing to leave after his daily visits that had become as essential to him as breathing, but felt awkward and formal, like he was a guest in a life he wanted desperately to be part of. "Why do you go home to that big empty house every night?" Jared paused in the doorway, his expensive briefcase in one hand, his car keys in the other. Amaya was resting on the couch, her leg propped up on pillows, pretending she wasn't listening to every word, while scrolling through lesson plans she couldn't currently teach. She was wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, and she looked more beautiful to him than any of the carefully polished women he'd dated over the years. "Poachiti, because that's where I live, buddy," Jared said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. His penthouse, with its stunning views and expensive furniture and oppressive silence, had never felt less like home. "But we need help," Micah said, with the particular brand of persistence that only 8-year-olds possess, the kind that cuts through adult pretense like a knife through butter. "Mom can't cook with those crutches she tried yesterday and almost fell down. And I'm not allowed to use the stove by myself because I'm too little. You could stay and help us. You could cook and help me with homework and make sure Mom doesn't try to do too much." The logic was unassailable. The implications were terrifying. "Micah," Amaya said gently, though there was something in her voice, surprise maybe, or hope disguised as caution. "Your father has his own life, his own home. He can't just stay." "Oh, why not?" Micah interrupted, with the kind of directness that adults spend years learning to avoid. "He doesn't have a wife or other kids. He doesn't even have a dog." What's stopping him? Jared found himself looking at Amaya, waiting for her to answer a question that wasn't really meant for her. What was stopping him? Pride, fear, the carefully constructed boundaries he'd spent 8 years maintaining. The terror of getting too close to something real and having to risk losing it again. "I could stay," he said quietly, the words coming out before he could second-guess them. "I could sleep on the couch, help with cooking, with Micah's homework, with whatever you need. Just until you're back on your feet." Amaya's eyes searched his face, looking for something, calculation maybe, or hidden motives, or the same fear that had driven him away 8 years ago. "Jared, we can't just play house because it's convenient right now. I'm not talking about playing house. I'm talking about being a family, even if it's just temporary." "Nothing about this feels temporary to me," she said, and there was something in her voice, a warning maybe, or a plea, or the sound of someone who had already been abandoned once and couldn't survive it happening again. He moved back into the room, set down his briefcase, and knelt beside her couch so they were eye level. This close, he could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the way pain had carved new lines around her mouth, the stubborn strength that had carried her through 8 years of single motherhood. Then maybe it doesn't have to be. For 2 weeks they lived in a strange sort of domestic limbo that felt both natural and terrifying. Jared slept on the couch, a piece of furniture that had clearly been chosen for looks rather than comfort, but that somehow felt more restful than his king-sized bed at home. He woke early to make breakfast before Micah's school, spent his days working from Amaya's kitchen table so he could help her when she needed it, and discovered that conference calls sounded different when conducted in a space filled with family photos and Micah's artwork instead of steel and glass and corporate sterility. In the evenings, they cooked together well, Jared cooked, while Amaya directed from her perch at the counter, offering suggestions and gentle corrections, and Micah provided commentary on everything from seasoning to life philosophy. It was chaotic and imperfect, and absolutely nothing like the carefully orchestrated dinners Jared was used to, and he'd never been happier. "You're putting too much salt in the pasta water," Amaya would say, laughing at his earnest attempts to follow her grandmother's recipe for marinara sauce. "There's no such thing as too much salt." Micah would interject with the authority of someone who had been helping his mother cook since he was tall enough to reach the counter. "Dad, you need to taste everything as you go. Mom taught me that." And Jared would taste and adjust and taste again, marveling at how something as simple as cooking dinner could feel like the most important thing he'd ever done. It was during one of these evenings, 3 weeks into their strange new arrangement, that the real revelation came. They were making spaghetti, Micah's favorite, a weekly tradition that Jared was slowly learning to appreciate when Amaya's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and her whole body tensed in a way that made Jared immediately alert. "Who is it?" he asked, noticing her reaction. My mother." Amaya stared at the phone like it was a snake that might bite her if she got too close. "I should answer it. She only calls when she's worried, and if I don't pick up, she'll assume the worst." Mom, Micah shouted with delight when Amaya put the phone on speaker. His voice carried across the small kitchen with the kind of excitement that only grandmothers could inspire. "Guess what? Dad's living with us now. He makes pancakes for breakfast and helps me with my math homework, and last night he read me 3 whole chapters of Harry Potter." The silence on the other end was deafening. Jared could practically hear Amaya's mother processing this information, weighing it against 8 years of carefully maintained distance, and probably preparing to deliver judgment. Finally, a woman's voice, sharp, skeptical, carrying the particular brand of protective anger that mothers reserve for the people who hurt their children, cut through the kitchen. "Is that so? And how long is this little arrangement supposed to last?" "Hi, Mrs. Brooks," Jared said, stepping closer to the phone with the kind of nervous energy he usually reserved for hostile board meetings. "I'm Jared." "Oh, I know exactly who you are, Mr. Cole." The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You're the man who abandoned my daughter when she needed you most. You're the man who let his child grow up thinking his father was too important to love him. You're the man who chose money over family and left my baby to raise a son by herself." Each word hit like a physical blow. Jared glanced at Micah, who had stopped stirring the sauce and was listening with wide eyes that seemed to take in everything and judge nothing. This was the reckoning he'd been avoiding for 8 years, delivered by a woman who had every right to hate him. Amaya said desperately, "Please don't. We tried on." "Don't what?" "Don't tell the truth. This man broke your heart once, baby girl. He chose his reputation over his family. He chose his image over his love. And now when it's convenient for him, when you're injured and vulnerable and need help, he shows up playing the hero. Shikokachi. He saved us at the hospital." Micah said quietly, his voice small but determined. "He stayed with me all night when I was scared. He held me when I cried. He told me Mom was going to be okay even when he didn't know if it was true. That's what fathers are supposed to do, baby. That doesn't make him special. That makes him barely adequate." Jared felt the weight of every accusation, every truth in Mrs. Brooks's words. She was right about everything. He had abandoned them. He had chosen money over family. He had broken Amaya's heart and let his son grow up feeling unwanted. But he also felt something else. The fierce protectiveness that comes with finally understanding what you stand to lose, and the desperate courage that comes with knowing this might be your last chance to get it right. "You're right. he said into the phone, his voice steady despite the way his hands were shaking. You're absolutely right about everything. I did choose money over family. I did break Amaya's heart. I did let my son grow up thinking I didn't love him. But Mrs. Brooks, I'm not here because it's convenient. I'm here because I finally realized that everything I thought mattered doesn't matter at all without them. I'm here because I love your daughter, and I love my son, and I'm tired of being too proud and too scared to fight for them. Pretty words, she replied coldly. You had pretty words 8 years ago, too. Your pretty words convinced my daughter to fall in love with you once before. How do we know this isn't just more of the same? How do we know you won't disappear again the minute things get difficult? Before Jared could answer, Micah spoke up with the wisdom that only children possess, the kind that cuts through adult complications and gets straight to the heart of things. Because he makes Mom laugh now. Like really laugh. The kind of laughing she does when she thinks I'm not looking, when she's folding laundry or making coffee and suddenly she just smiles. And he doesn't check his phone when I'm talking to him anymore. And yesterday when Mom was crying because her leg hurt and she couldn't do things for herself, he cried too. Rich people don't cry fake tears, do they? Mom. The kitchen fell silent, except for the bubbling of the pasta water. Even Mrs. Brooks seemed to be processing this observation, weighing the words of an 8-year-old against 8 years of justified anger. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, though still cautious. Amaya, baby, are you there? I'm here, Mom. Do you love him? Really love him? Not the man you remember from 8 years ago. Not the man you wish he could be, but the man standing in your kitchen right now. The question hung in the air like smoke. Jared stopped breathing. Micah stopped stirring. Even the pasta seemed to stop bubbling. This was the moment everything hinged on the question that would determine whether they moved forward as a family or fell apart as strangers who happened to share a child. Yes. Amaya whispered, her voice so soft Jared almost missed it. I never stopped. So 8 months later, Jared Cole did something he had never done in his 15-year career. He turned down a deal that would have made him $50 million and changed his life forever. The Nakamura Corporation had been courting his company for months, flying in executives from Tokyo, wining and dining him at the most expensive restaurants in Manhattan, offering astronomical sums for an acquisition that would have catapulted him into billionaire status. The contract was sitting on his desk that Friday morning, unsigned, the culmination of months of negotiations and the deal of his lifetime. All he had to do was sign his name, and everything he'd worked for would be complete. But everything had changed. The man who would have signed that contract without hesitation 6 months ago no longer existed. Micah bounded into his home office after school. Not the sterile corporate office he used to inhabit, but a corner of the living room in the house they'd bought together, a space that smelled like coffee and Amaya's perfume, and the particular chaos that comes with a 9-year-old who builds elaborate Lego structures in every available corner. I guess what happened today? Jared pushed the contract aside and gave his son his full attention, a skill he was still learning, but getting better at every day. The ability to be present, to focus completely on the person in front of him, instead of the next meeting, the next deal, the next achievement, that would never quite fill the emptiness inside him. What happened, buddy? Mrs. Peterson said I could be the narrator for our class play about families. She said I have a good voice for storytelling and that I understand what makes families special. Jared's heart swelled with pride. Not the cold satisfaction of a business victory, but the warm, overwhelming love that comes with watching your child discover their own gifts. That's amazing. When is the performance? Next Friday at 2 o'clock. Can you come? Mom's going to be there, and Grandma Brooks is flying in from Atlanta, and Grandma Helen promised to make her famous chocolate chip cookies for afterward. Friday at 2 o'clock. Jared glanced at his calendar, knowing what he'd find there. The Nakamura signing was scheduled for exactly that time, 2 p.m. Eastern, 3 a.m. in Tokyo. The culmination of months of negotiations and time zone calculations, and the kind of diplomatic scheduling that major international deals require. 8 months ago, there wouldn't have been a question. Business came first. Money came first. Success came first. He would have told Micah he'd try to make it knowing he wouldn't, and then sent flowers and an expensive gift to make up for his absence. Again. But that was before he learned what it felt like to be the most important person in someone's world. Before he understood that his son's proudest moments weren't worth anything if no one was there to witness them. Before he realized that all the money in the world couldn't buy back the moments he'd already missed. "I'll be there," Jared said, and meant it completely. "Wild horses couldn't keep me away. Even if you have important business stuff, Sunki. There's nothing more important than watching you tell stories about families." That evening, after Micah had gone to bed and they'd finished the dishes together, a ritual that had somehow become sacred in their household, Jared sat with Amaya on their back porch. They'd been officially living together for 4 months now, married for 2, but they still marveled at the simple pleasure of quiet evenings like this. "You rescheduled the Nakamura meeting, didn't you?" Amaya asked, though it wasn't really a question. She knew him well enough now to recognize the signs of a major decision. "I canceled it entirely. Told them if they couldn't work around my son's school schedule, they weren't the right partners for my company." Amaya was quiet for a moment, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Do you regret it?" Jared considered the question seriously. A year ago, passing up $50 million would have felt like cutting off his own arm. It would have been unthinkable, impossible, a betrayal of everything he'd worked for. Now it felt like the easiest decision he'd ever made. "I regret a lot of things," he said finally. "I regret not being there when you were pregnant. I regret missing Micah's first words, his first steps, his first day of school. I regret 8 years of choosing fear over love, pride over vulnerability, image over truth. But walking away from money to be present for my family, that's the first decision I've made in years that I know I'll never regret." The school play was exactly what you'd expect from a class of 9-year-olds, chaotic, adorable, and surprisingly moving. Micah stood at the front of the small auditorium, wearing a tie that Jared had helped him knot that morning, and a confidence that seemed to radiate from every pore. He spoke about different kinds of families, with the serious concentration of someone delivering a presidential address, his young voice carrying across the room with unexpected power. "Some families live in the same house from the beginning." He said his words carefully memorized but delivered with genuine feeling. "But some families have to find each other. Sometimes the grown-ups make mistakes and have to learn how to be a family. Sometimes people get scared and run away from love because they think safety is more important than happiness. But that doesn't make them less of a family. It just makes them a family that knows how hard love can be, and how worth it love is when you're brave enough to choose it." In the audience, Jared reached for Amaya's hand, marveling at how their son had managed to articulate something it had taken him 40 years to understand. She was crying, not unusual anymore since she'd gotten comfortable showing her emotions around him. But these were good tears, proud tears, the kind that come from watching your child become exactly who they're meant to be. After the play, as they were gathering their things to leave, another parent approached them. Jennifer Martinez was the mother of one of Micah's classmates, and she had the particular expression of someone working up the courage to say something potentially awkward. "Excuse me," she said to Jared. "Aren't you Jared Cole from Cole Technologies? Jared tensed, waiting for whatever was coming next. Comments about his money, his success, his reputation as a business shark who put profit over everything else. The kind of recognition that used to fill him with pride, but now felt hollow and meaningless. I just wanted to say, Jennifer continued, my daughter talks about Micah all the time. She says he's the kindest boy in their class, that he always makes sure no one sits alone at lunch. And after hearing him speak today, well, it's clear you're raising an incredible young man. It was such a simple compliment, but it hit Jared like a revelation. For the first time in his adult life, someone was praising him not for his business acumen or his wealth or his ability to close deals, but for his parenting. For the kind of man he was helping his son become. For something that actually mattered. Thank you, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That means more to me than you know. That night, as he was tucking Micah into bed, another ritual that had become precious to him, his son asked the question that had been building for months. Dad, are you going to marry Mom again? They had eloped 6 months after moving in together, a simple ceremony at City Hall, with just Helen Cole and Mrs. Brooks as witnesses, but Micah had been campaigning for a real wedding, with all their friends and family, the celebration they'd never had. Would you like us to have a big wedding? Jared asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. I think so. I mean, we're already a family, and you already married her. But I think Mom would like it if we had a party to celebrate. She said once that every girl dreams about dancing at her own wedding. Jared smiled, thinking about the small velvet box hidden in his sock drawer, the ring he'd been carrying for weeks, while he worked up the courage to ask Amaya if she wanted to do this right, if she wanted the wedding she'd dreamed of as a little girl. Well, he said, we can't have your mom missing out on dancing at her own wedding, can we? 2 weeks later, on a Saturday evening in the same park where Micah had taken his first tentative steps as a toddler, Jared Cole got down on one knee in front of his wife and asked her to marry him again. This time he had a ring, not the biggest or most expensive one in the store, but one that Amaya had admired months ago when they'd walked past a jewelry store window. This time he had words that came from his heart instead of his head. This time he was choosing love first, last, and always. Amaya Brooks Cole. He said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. 8 years ago, I was too afraid to choose love. I thought success meant building walls, protecting myself, keeping my options open. But you and Micah have taught me that real success isn't about what you accomplish. It's about who you become. And I want to become the husband you deserve and the father Micah needs, not just in private, but in front of everyone we love. Will you marry me again? Amaya's answer was a kiss that tasted like tears and laughter and the promise of a celebration they'd both dreamed of. In the background, Micah whooped and cheered, then ran over to tackle both his parents in a hug that nearly knocked them all over. Does this mean we get to have a real wedding with dancing? He asked excitedly. It means, Jared said, looking at his family, his real family. We get to celebrate our love the way it deserves to be celebrated. 1 year later, Jared Cole sat in the same hospital room where everything had changed, but this time the circumstances were purely joyful. However, what no one expected was the surprise that would make this moment even more meaningful. Amaya was in the bed, exhausted, but radiant, holding their newborn daughter with the careful reverence of someone who understood that life was both fragile and miraculous. But as the nurse handed Jared the birth certificate to sign, she paused. Could he, Mr. Cole? There's something unusual about your daughter's birth time. She was born at exactly 3:17 a.m., the same time and date that your other daughter would have been born 8 years ago if she had survived. The room fell silent. Amaya's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at baby Grace. It's like hope sent her, Micah whispered, now 10, and taking his role as big brother with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice. It's like she wanted to make sure Grace found her way to us. Eleanor Brooks, who had become a permanent fixture in their lives, nodded knowingly. In my family, we believe that souls choose their families. Grace chose you just like hope blessed you by bringing you all together. 3 months later, Cole Technologies announced something unprecedented in the tech industry, a comprehensive family leave policy that included both parents regardless of gender for up to 6 months at full pay. But the real shock came during the press conference. This isn't just about our employees, Jared announced to the gathered media. We're also establishing the Hope Foundation, a nonprofit that provides support for families who have experienced pregnancy loss and helps single parents access resources they need to thrive. What no one knew was that Amaya had been working behind the scenes, using her experience as a teacher and her journey as a single mother to design programs that would actually make a difference. My wife will be serving as the foundation's director, Jared continued, because she understands better than anyone what it means to build a life from hope even when hope seems impossible. The Foundation's first initiative, a scholarship program for children who had grown up in single-parent homes, ensuring they had access to educational opportunities regardless of their circumstances. On Micah's 11th birthday, as the family gathered in their backyard, something extraordinary happened. Micah stood up to make a speech that left every adult speechless. I used to wish I had a normal family, he began, his young voice carrying across the yard filled with friends and relatives. You know, the kind where the mom and dad live together from the beginning and everything is easy. But I learned something important this year. He looked at his parents, then at baby Grace sleeping in Amaya's arms. Normal families don't learn how to fight for love. They don't understand how precious it is to choose each other every single day. They don't know what it feels like to almost lose everything and then get it back better than it ever was before. Helen Cole, now 68, wiped tears from her eyes. That boy is going to change the world someday. He already has, Mrs. Brooks said softly. He changed ours. As the birthday party wound down and Grace was sleeping and Micah was in his room reading Jared, and Amaya found themselves back on their porch swing, but this time they weren't alone. Eleanor Brooks, now in her 90s but still sharp as a tack, joined them. She said, settling into her chair with the satisfied air of someone who had lived long enough to see love triumph over fear. When Amaya first told me about you 8 years ago, I told her something I want to share with you now. Jared and Amaya turned to listen. I said, some people come into our lives to teach us about love, and some come to teach us about loss. The rare ones teach us that love and loss can coexist, and that the deepest love often comes from choosing someone again after you've lost them. She smiled at them both. You taught each other that love isn't just a feeling, it's a daily choice to stay, to fight, to forgive, and to hope. And that's the greatest gift you can give Grace and Micah, the knowledge that real love doesn't give up. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jared thought about the question that had started it all. Why don't you love my mom? Now he knew the answer wasn't just that he did love her. It was that love itself had taught him how to love. The pain of losing them had shown him what he truly valued. The fear of loving them had revealed how brave love requires you to be. Just before they went inside, Micah appeared in the doorway, carrying something in his hands. Dad, I made something for you, he said, approaching the porch with the shy pride of a child presenting a treasured creation. It was a photo album carefully assembled with pictures from the past year. The first page showed a photo from that terrible dinner 8 months ago, the three of them sitting stiffly around the table, strangers to each other. The last page showed a picture from Grace's birth, all of them crowded together in the hospital bed faces, glowing with joy and love, and the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting for something beautiful. At the bottom of the last page in Micah's careful handwriting were the words, "Some families are born, some families are made. The best families choose each other every single day." Amaya smiled through her tears. "That sounds like something you would say." "He gets his wisdom from his mother," Jared and Eleanor said in unison, then laughed at their predictable response. As they all headed inside Eleanor to the guest room, she now occupied permanently Micah to his room filled with books and dreams, Grace to her nursery, where hope lived in every soft breath. Jared understood something profound about second chances and the way love could rewrite history. The family that had once been broken was now whole. Not perfect, they still struggled. Sometimes still faced challenges, still had to choose love over fear on the difficult days. But they were whole. And whole, Jared had discovered, was more than enough. It was everything. Whether you're seeking forgiveness, offering second chances, or simply trying to be brave enough to choose love over fear, remember Jared's journey. Success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by who you become and who you love along the way. Sometimes the most important question isn't, why don't you love them, but what's stopping you from loving them now? Fear, pride. The belief that it's too late to change. Jared's story reminds us that it's never too late to choose love, to show up, to be brave enough to fight for the family you want, instead of settling for the isolation you think you deserve. If you believe in the power of second chances and the healing that comes from choosing love, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to choose love over fear, presence over profit, vulnerability over pride.